In this video, we're going to look at some strategies for planning your site's layout. And this whole strategy is going to center around the concept of wireframing, being able to analyze a wireframe and then turn that into HTML and CSS that achieves that look. We're going to assume some familiarity already with wireframing because you've taken other design classes. But essentially a wireframe is just a visual representation of what you hope the eventual outcome will be. So I've created a wireframe here in the program Figma. You can use any application for this. Adobe Illustrator, Canva is another option. There are multiple options out there, but Figma is a free online application you can use for wireframing. And I've got this really simple layout of just a few photos and some text. And what I want to do, if this is what I want my page to eventually look like, or at least a section of my page to look like, I need to think about how to organize these things into sort of different elements. How are they going to be organized inside of HTML elements, and where do I need tags to organize it that way? So I can see that everything is sort of in one main row. All of the content from left to right can be put into this sort of container here, and I don't want it to actually be solid like this. I'm going to make this create an outline here. So let me get rid of the fill and add a stroke. And we're going to color code this so that we know where the different elements, where the different sort of containers are that we need for this. Let's make this a little thicker. There we go. We've got this red outline there. Okay, so everything's going to be in this one main row, but then I do have two things in the center that are clearly organized a little bit differently. We've sort of got this inner column of content that needs to be wrapped then in its own outline. And that's going to show me where I'll need another element in my HTML to contain those two things. We'll make this one green. Oops. Let's get that stroke there. There we go. Sorry, I meant to change the color and change the stroke. Okay. Great. Green, please. There we go. Okay, a green column with a red row on the outside. I want to give some credit to the YouTuber Kevin Powell. He puts out videos regularly about front-end web design, HTML and CSS stuff, and I've adapted his approach slightly. So you can watch his video if you would like. It's just his approach is a little different. I've simplified it slightly for our purposes, but this video called A Simple Approach to Layouts when going from design to code. You can check that out if you would like to just see how someone else does the same thing. All right, so now if I'm going to put stuff into a row, I need to think about using Flexboxes. You might already be familiar with Flexboxes. It's one possible approach in CSS to create responsive layouts. Flexboxes are typically best for one-dimensional rows or columns, but you can certainly nest Flexboxes inside of each other. In fact, that's exactly what I've got in this wireframe. I've got a column nested inside of a row. So Flexbox is going to be pretty useful for this particular layout. There are a lot of different properties that you can adjust with Flexbox. So these are the 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. These are the 7 that I would say are the most important to sort of get a grasp on and can probably help you achieve just about any layout that you'll need for this particular class. So let's go through these one at a time, and I'm going to actually move over to, I've got my responsive image gallery code spaces open here. And just as a quick sort of hint, if you've made some changes, like I've sort of typed in some random text here, if you've made some changes that you don't want to keep, you can actually go to your source control panel and you can discard them. I can click this button here that says discard changes and get rid of that. And I don't know why this is here. Let's get rid of that as well. Okay, so I've just discarded any changes that were made since I last committed because I want to go back to sort of the original, and hopefully there we go. So we're updated back to just our sort of default template here. Let's get some images in here. I've got those images prepped already in my downloads. So I'm going to bring in my 3 cookie images, pink cookies, white cookies, rat cookies. and drop them in my images folder all the way over here. Great. Okay, so I'm going to keep my wireframe application open next to my code so that I can actually sort of go back and forth and tweak it a little bit and get it in the get it looking the way I want it to. All right, so we've got one main outer element. That's our red outline. So let's make a div tag here, and I'm going to give it a class of flex row, because ultimately it is a row. That class doesn't do anything on its own. I still have to define what that class styling is in my CSS. But just to start with, don't worry about the CSS yet. Let's start with just our div and whatever elements we're going to need and get those set up before we worry about the styling. Okay, so from there, I know I'm going to start with an image. And remember from one of our previous videos, I highly suggest putting every image inside of a div or a figure element because it's going to make this flexible layout a lot easier to achieve. So I've got a container div for my image, and my first image, let's go back to my layout here, is the pink cookies. Now these images, I was really careful about making sure that these images had a aspect ratio that worked for the layout that I wanted to achieve. So keep that in mind when you're choosing images. You can either crop them, or you can just make sure that you start with an image that's in the proper aspect ratio for what you're trying to do. And it's not showing up because I forgot to put the images folder name in front there. There we go. Okay, notice it's massive, but don't worry about that yet. Try to get your HTML structure in place first. All right, so right next to that, I've got my green div here that I'm going to worry about next. That's the next part of what will become my Flexbox row. So we're going to make this div here, and I'm going to give it a class of flex column because it's going to be, I'm going to give it the column property. Okay, so two things in there. We've got a p tag with some text. I'm going to just say lorem 20, and it makes it super long, but if I save, it formats it. And then I'm going to, let me just copy this image here, paste it down here, and then change the image name. Which one is in the middle there? Rack cookies is in the middle. Okay, so my flex column, is this a complete div? Let's see here. If I notice that if I click on the first opening div tag, it highlights the corresponding closing tag. So I know that this element is complete. It has an opening tag and a closing tag. What's this closing tag right below it? It's the one that corresponds to the opening of my main row. All right, so we need one more thing in here, which is our last image. So I'll copy this container here again so I don't have to retype all of that. And this is white cookies. Okay, so I think this is complete. Let's look at this again. We've got an image on the left, the first thing in our main outer div, the one represented by the red outline. We have a p tag and an image inside of our inner column, which is represented by our flex column class. And then we have our last image over here. Our preview looks nothing like that, right? But that's because we haven't styled anything yet. The structure is correct. The styling now is going to take care of the rest of it. So let's now go to our CSS, and we're going to turn, we've got a class called FlexRow. And what properties do we need here? Let's look at that list again. We have display. The display property is just going to create a Flexbox. You literally just set the display property to flex, and it lets it know that it is meant to be interpreted as a Flexbox. Okay, has anything changed? Let's see in our preview here. Okay, everything is actually in a row. It's just sized completely wrong, but let's keep going here, right? We're making steps towards the desired result. We're getting there one step at a time. The pink photos on the left, the rack cookies are in the middle, and the last one where sort of the cookies are on white papers on the right. That's exactly what my layout is meant to be. Okay, next thing I'm going to do is, if you remember from our optimizing images video, we're going to set a max width of all images by default to be 100%. And look at that, already it's a huge improvement. It's a giant step back towards my desired result. This is why setting a width property or a height property is so important, because if you don't do that, by default, the image is just going to display at its native resolution, which is much larger than it needs to be. I did reduce the size on these, but I have them a little bit larger than necessary because it's sort of complicated, right? We want the resolution to be high enough that even on very high quality displays, it still looks good. But we don't want it to be so high that it ends up being a huge file size. The file size of these are still quite small. All right, so what do we need to do now? Now we need to look at some of the other style properties we have here. Flex direction. Your options for flex direction are column or row, and row is the default. So far, that's working out okay. However, I know I have a column in the middle. Now, it already looks like a column in my layout here, but I want a little bit more control over how this column is spaced and how it's set up there and how it's sized and everything. So remember, we gave that a class in the HTML of flex column for that middle column. So I need to do the same thing as I did with my first row here. I'm going to give it display flex. By default, that makes it a row. So I have a row here embedded in an outer row, but I don't want that to be a row. I want it to be a column. So this one does need that property of flex direction column. It looks like it's about the same as it was before, right? But we have other properties of Flexboxes that we can now, because we've turned it into a Flexbox, we have some other properties we can apply that are going to make that a little bit nicer. Okay, moving down our list here. We're going to skip flex wrap for now. Flex wrap basically just controls if you have too many things in one row, it'll wrap them around to the next line. And we're really not going to need that for a while yet until we get to some of the later projects. So let's move on now to justify content and align items. So what are these for here? Well, right now my photos are set to a max width of 100%. So they're going to take up as much space as they possibly can. But what if they were smaller? What if I said they had a max width of only 200 pixels? That's going to be tiny. Okay, so now what I want is I want some control over the width of each of these elements. And in order to do that, I'm going to need to use this justify content property. Justify content is going to control how things are arranged from left to right in this row. Do I want them to be evenly spaced? Do I want them to be grouped in the center? Do I want them to be spread out with some space on the edges as well as between them? That's what the justify content is for. Let me actually also make my middle flex column, give that a width of 200 pixels. So these are all the exact same. Okay, there we go. So we've got three. This particular property is probably not really what I want to use for my image gallery. I just want to make sure I demonstrate what justify content is for. So with these three things that are all 200 pixels wide, how do I make it so that they, group themselves in the center instead of all the way to the left? I can use justify content center. And there we go. They group themselves in the center of that flex box. If I use space between, it makes it so that the first item is all the way to the left, last item is all the way to the right, and the middle one is evenly spaced between the two of them. I can use probably the best of the justify contents for a look like that is space evenly. Make sure that there's just as much space on the left as there is in the middle, and then as there is in the right edge. Now, because it's a flex box, if I change the size of that window, it maintains those spacing properties. Got some visual glitches with my window changes here, but hopefully you can see that this row is flexible. It's responding to the size of that image, not just because of space evenly either. I can make this justify content center, and it's going to keep those items in the center no matter how wide my window is. Okay, I'm going to give my row a background color to help me better illustrate the next part here. Let's give it a really antique white, sure. Oh, nope, got to use a hex code. How about RGB2? So there's this cool little color selector here that's built into VS Code and code spaces. So if you have a color that you like, you can always put in the hex code. It'll give you this color preview. You click it and you can sort of convert it to these different properties here. So let's go with our hex code there of the background color. And I want to give this row a fixed height of, I don't know, let's try like 10 rem. That's too short. Let's try 30 rem. Okay, so I did that because previously the div was only as tall as it needed to be. My flex row div was only as tall as it needed to be to contain those images. There was no extra space above or below. So now that my div is taller, I have some space to play with the vertical alignment. Previously, justify content was playing with the horizontal alignment. Align items is going to play with the vertical alignment. So I can, if I want these things to be in the center of my row, I use align item center, and then it groups them in the center. So grouping them in the center vertically on that axis, that's align items, whereas justify content center is what's grouping them in the center horizontally. Maybe I'll change that back to space around so we can see. There we go. So we got this really nice flexible box with a background color. And I think these images are too small, but I intentionally sort of limited their size so we could see how these properties in Flexbox work. Okay, to show the next couple properties, I want to go back to the previous setup I had where nothing was limited in its height or width. So let me get rid of the height on the row, and let me get rid of the width on my middle column, change my image width back to 100%. Okay, so this is sort of back to our original layout. That it looks more like our wireframe layout than some of the other things we had just been playing around with. Now, I don't like that the images are right up next to each other. I want them to have some space between them. And that's what the gap property is for. So after justified content, after align items, we're looking at gap here, and you're just defining how much space you want between the elements in the row. So let's try like a gap of 1 character. I'm applying this to my parent, my sort of outer flex row. And we're going to put a gap of 1 ch. And there we go. It automatically does the spacing for us. And again, no matter what size the window is, it keeps that inner gap of 1 character width between the items there. Let's get rid of this ugly background color too. There we go. Okay. Can make that gap larger. Let's try 3 characters. That's a little bit better. How does that look compared to our wireframe? It looks pretty close. Okay. So now, with the column in the center, I don't have that much text. I don't have that image in the center. I don't want to stretch it. I don't want to make it taller than the original aspect ratio. So how can I make that middle column look a little bit nicer so that the text and the photo are spread out? I want the text to be all the way on the top, and I want the photo to be on the bottom, aligned with the edges of the other photos, just like my wireframe. Now, I don't have as much text in here, but we want this to be responsive. So even if it has a small amount of text or a large amount of text, the top part of the text element should be aligned with the top of the photos, and the bottom of that middle photo should be aligned with the outer photos as well. So think about the spacing stuff that we just looked at for Flexboxes, justify content and align items. This is a column, so those two things are going to be flipped. Justify content now deals with how things are spread out vertically instead of horizontally. And align items is going to be dealing with things horizontally instead of vertically. Why does it make that difference? Well, think about the sort of the axis of a row versus the axis of a column. I'll try to sort of like draw. So if I have a row going left to right, justify content is controlling things on my main axis, which is horizontal, and align items is controlling things on my secondary axis, which is vertical. If I turn a Flexbox into a column and rotate everything, now align items is dealing with my secondary axis, which is left to right spacing, horizontal spacing, and justify content is still my primary axis, which since it's a column is now vertical. So to spread these out in a column, I'm going to use justify content and we'll do space between. That'll make sure that there's always, the two elements are always sort of pushed. Space between. The styling that we were putting on the flex column was just fine. We've got display flex, flex direction column, and justify content space between. And I've left it in the sort of not working state so I can show you what the heck's going on here. It was actually the align items center of our parent row that was affecting the alignment of those two middle elements there. So if I remove align items center, it does exactly what I expected, which is my P tag staying at the top and aligned with the two photos, and then my other cookie image sort of aligning with the bottom edges of those other two cookies. So this actually is a great example of it. You know, I use the developer tools to try to help me with what was going on there. It showed me where there was padding. It let me sort of test out different properties with live editing. And the actual fix here was write as little CSS as possible. I left align items up here because I had demonstrated it when we were looking at that property, and I didn't actually need it anymore. It was actually causing some things to be styled in a way that I didn't expect. So this minimal sort of CSS that I wrote here actually achieves exactly the look I'm looking for. Now, if you compare it to our wireframe, the only difference is that when the window gets really wide, that's when we start to have some extra space in the middle here, but that's okay. It's a flexible layout. It's doing kind of what we expected. I have one more change that I want to make here, which is set an upper limit to how wide this content can go. If I keep moving my window over, it gets as big as it wants to. And if I were to say, let's pop this out into its own window so I can make it even wider here. There we go. So it's filling the entire body all the way from left to right. And I sort of want it to be neatly contained in the center. So in order to do that, what I'm going to do is add a max width to my flex row. So my main flex row here, I've got display flex to turn it into a row. I've got a gap of 3 characters, and I'm going to set a max width of 1100 pixels. Why am I choosing 1100 pixels? Check the style guide. This is one of our targets. This is what we want to make sure our sites look good all the way up to 1100 pixels wide, but we don't want the content to continue growing indefinitely beyond that. And why is it not in the center here? Well, that's because the size of it is limited to 1100 pixels, but we haven't told it how to align itself within the body. How do we do that? Well, we could easily turn the body into a Flexbox, but that would be kind of a sort of an overkill way to do that. So what I'm actually going to do here is I'm going to style a main element and turn that into a Flexbox and center everything in the main element. I don't have a main element in my HTML yet, but this is sort of one extra parent, sort of a finishing touch I'm going to put on this to make sure that even though the size of my row cannot grow beyond 1100 pixels, it will always be in the center of the window no matter how large the window is. So back in my HTML, I'm going to put a main element inside the body, and I'm going to open and close it. It literally contains everything. So it's sort of like it's one level inside of the body. It's just a way to make it so that we don't have to apply styling that we don't want to the body itself. We've made this container that's going to ensure that the whole body can continue stretching left to right all the way to fill the entire page, and anything inside of it is going to be centered. Okay, so Flex, that's our last Flexbox property to look at. It's kind of a strange one to understand, but what Flex does is it actually controls proportionally how much space each element inside of the Flexbox will inhabit. It's not going to really work well for our current layout, but I can sort of use it to just demonstrate. I'll use my existing project here to demonstrate what Flex does. So let's say that I want the photo on the left, the pink photo, to take up twice as much space as the other two photos. So it's going to get a flex of 2, and the other ones are going to have a flex of 1. I'm going to double the size of this pink photo. And let me actually put my two windows side by side again. Make it a lot easier to watch my preview while I make changes. All right, so the pink photo is inside of the first div, right? So let's give that a class of pink. How about pink container? And then I'm going to give the other two a class of, or you know what? Not pink container. Let's call that a double flex. And then we'll give the other two a class of single flex. Now, my middle element already has a class of flex column, and that's okay. I'm going to add a second class to it called single flex. It'll apply the properties from both of those classes. My right div, my last div, is going to also get a single flex. Oops, I don't know why I didn't write class first. There we go. Okay, so all I've done is added classes so that I can start applying some of these flex properties. So the flex properties are applied not to the box, not to the container around everything, the parent element. They're actually applied to the individual elements inside of the row. All right, so let's go over to my CSS here, and I'm going to give double flex. Anything that has a double flex class has a flex property of 2, and everything that has single flex will have a flex property of 1. Okay. Oh, that looks awful, right? But you can hopefully see that the pink photo is taking up twice the width of the row as the other two elements. The spacing here is all weird because I made my columns spread out like that. If I change the size here, it'll probably illustrate a little bit better how the width of this pink photo is now. It's proportionally taking up 2 times the amount of the flex row as the other two divs. This center div column here, and then this div over here contains that photo. And it's completely messed up because it's not as wide as it needs to be to make the photo taller, right? But that's what Flex does. There's certainly cases where it's going to be handy, but I don't think it is appropriate for this particular layout. So I'm going to delete those two classes and not apply those properties anymore. We've got one last thing to look at in this long video. I apologize for the Flexbox part being so long, but I can't stress enough how important Flexbox is going to be to achieving especially flexible layouts, but even just being able to put things in rows and columns and really visually cleanly organize everything. So the last thing on our agenda here is to take a quick look at media queries. Media queries are used to adjust the style properties of things in relation to the width of the window. If I have a window that's extremely narrow versus a window that's extremely wide, there are some things inside of the layout that I probably want to change to better adapt to those different screen sizes. So here's my layout here. It looks pretty great at a medium size. If I get too narrow, keep going. Oh, it starts to look not so great at these narrower sizes. My photos get tiny, and my center column is taking up more space than the other two. So all I have to do in a media query is say, what do I want to change about my layout when we get to those smaller sizes? I've already created a media query for you in this particular project, and there will always be a couple of predefined media queries in the projects for the class. This one specifically says when the screen gets to be to a max width of 480 pixels, what do you want to change? When our window is that narrow, when it's 480 pixels or smaller, what do you want to change about the layout here? Well, I'm going to do something really simple, and this is a really common thing to do with media queries. I'm going to turn my main row into a column instead of a row, right? I think that would fit these photos better if everything just like sort of rearranged vertically once I got to this narrow size. So in my media query, I'm going to address the flex row. That's the class that I'm using for my sort of main parent container. And I only have to put what's changing in here. I already have defined it as display flex, so I don't have to write that. All I want to write is that I'm changing the flex direction to column when it's that narrow. And if I get narrow enough, I might have to open my responsive design mode to see a window that narrow. Let's try that out here. So going to more tools, responsive design mode. Let's set this to 480 pixels wide. Okay, and we are good to go here. The media query is written correctly. I was having some trouble getting it to work initially because for some reason the preview over here wasn't refreshing. So I just manually refreshed it. You can just click the refresh button in your browser, and for some reason adjusting the media query didn't force it to auto refresh on its own. So once I get down to 480 pixels, everything now is in a column. So some of your designs you're not going to need media queries depending upon how your design is specifically put together, how your layout works. But it's good to know that option is there in case there's ever a specific layout where, hey, I really like the way this layout works at 800 pixels wide. I like the way it looks at 1100 pixels wide. But once I get down to 480 in particular, or even sort of around that, I could probably make that media query kick in sooner, but it definitely starts to have problems when I get to that smaller size there. So that's a quick overview of media queries, and hopefully the content in this video will help you think about how to plan your layout designs going from the wireframe to the actual code.